You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. We're going to be covering garden cities with Chris as our general theme. We're also going to be talking about a prize that has taken place to get people and different organisations involved in thinking about garden cities. But firstly, Chris, it's good to have you back in the studio.
Thank you, Daniel. Good to be back, and nice to see you looking so well.
Yes, it's nice to be a nice sort of light sunny day after sort of the long winter. So yeah.
Well, we can't complain. We might be able to complain about the football, but not the weather.
No. Well, I was hoping firstly if you could just give our listeners a little introduction into Design South East. First of all.
Of course, Daniel. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We work across the whole of the South East, everywhere from Norfolk down to Brighton and Oxfordshire right over to Margate. So a huge area, really. But we do three things. We educate. We do a lot of education programmes, particularly for local authorities and the private sector now, increasingly. We also offer design advice, through a thing we call design review, and that happens very early in the planning process, and it helps raise the quality. And the third thing we do, which is becoming a more important part of our work, is to engage everybody in the future of their place and as how it takes shape. Giving people a stake in that place is incredibly important, and increasingly so, I think, and very relevant to what we're going to be talking about later on when we touch on solving the housing crisis in garden cities.
Well, I know we're going to talk, and you sent me some information through about this particular prize that's been running, so I was hoping you could give our listeners sort of a brief introduction, and perhaps we'll take a break and then talk a bit more about it.
Sure. Essentially, the prize is the Wolfson Economics Prize, which is this particular prize is themed entirely on garden cities, and if your listeners want to look it up, just Google Wolfson Garden City and it'll come up. It's actually an economics prize, oddly enough, but it's actually about how you make new places, new settlements. Of course, garden cities are not new. They've been around for a long time, well in Letchworth and such. But essentially, because we have what is an increasingly problematic housing crisis, we're simply not building enough homes to house the growing population. That is particularly in London and the South East. The idea is that really garden cities could be one of, if not in some people's eyes, the solution. So building entire new communities to house a growing population is essentially what this is about. And doing that in a way that, in the case of the garden cities, stays true to the kind of the founding kind of ethos of a garden city, which is around transport, it's around employment, it's around education, it's about quality of life. How we might do that for the 21st century is a really important problem, and that's exactly what the Wolfson Prize has tried to tackle.
Now, I assume this prize is something that takes place each year, and they've just particularly picked garden cities as their theme this year. Is that right? I imagine
it is. I think the reality is that it's quite a decent prize if you win it. It's £250,000. At the moment, they've shortlisted 5 finalists, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. But they've also credited some others who have put in that they highly commended, essentially, and also some young people, some 3 children who entered the prize, and they've each given them £500 from what I can gather, which is just fantastic. So you can see it's really trying to engage people in the debate.
Our theme is garden cities, and we're talking about a particular prize at the moment.
We are. It's the Wolfson Economics Prize, shortlisted so far 5 entries, from which presumably one winner will be picked. But the finalists, there's 5 finalists, and they've been given some additional time now to develop their proposals in more detail. I have to say, they're very readable, and listeners can download them, as you said, from the link on your blog. And what's interesting is, although they are very different, they have common themes. And we were just talking, Daniel, about this notion that, well, how do you actually make a new city? What do you actually do to do that? And I think you were saying that, could you look at something that kind of built up over time?
Well, yeah, I was wondering, rather than suddenly building this big city and everyone moves in almost on day one and everything's new and everyone's new, if you sort of build it slowly and people move in slowly, it kind of will develop and grow and become a place without this sudden everything new and everything having to find its own way, I suppose.
Well, the other benefit, of course, which is it runs through a couple of the entries, is this notion, or actually more than a couple, to a lesser or greater degree, but this notion that actually you don't build one monolithic thing, you build a number of different neighbourhoods or settlements. In the same way that, for instance, London is actually a collection, believe it or not, of villages that then came together. If you can keep it small, you can get more local ownership, which I think is the key thing, and then look at how the things then have their own distinctiveness. Each smaller part of the whole has its own kind of unique kind of aspects and feels like a place, a different place to the next one. And that, I think, begins to work very well.
Yeah, I think that is a good way. And I think also, if it's not so big, people don't feel it's a distant thing. So yeah, they can feel part of their place. It feels like their own little area and not this massive new town or city. Yeah,
exactly. And I think the other thing to be aware of is that I don't think there's universal support necessarily for the notion that garden cities are the solution to the housing crisis, but there's certainly one part of it, and that's a really important thing, because the other options, of course, is essentially filling in the missing teeth in a place. So if you've got a high street or a neighbourhood that's got missing houses, you fill that in first. The second thing you can do is extend a place, and these so-called urban extensions are happening in many, many places. And the third option, I'm really simplifying here, but I think it's important just to get these three things kind of just distinct, is that you can build a whole new settlement, as people did with Milton Keynes and such. It is entirely possible to do it.
I was going to say, that is Milton Keynes kind of an old-fashioned garden city in a way, or what was done in the past, or is garden city really the new name for an old idea?
You're right, Daniel. I think we have to be a little bit careful about this, because it sounds great, doesn't it, Garden City? You automatically kind of want to go and live there because it's really exciting, and we know that these places are incredibly livable. I mean, Letchworth is still very, very, very handsome place to live. But I suppose we do have to be a bit careful and think, well, what are we really getting? What kind of quality are we really getting? What kind of quality of place? How does it really work? How does the transport work? How does the employment? All these kind of things that we know now. So that we know now we need to get right in order for a place to thrive. So I suppose, I don't know what you think of this, but I think that this idea that really it probably is a 21st century update, but the conditions have changed so much. So we have to really adapt to the society now, as it is.
Yeah, but I also think it's, being careful you don't sort of design for what's in at the moment. And on this website I was looking at one of the videos you can watch, and one of the men, I think it was actually at the prize presentation, said, one of the things you can do if you build a new city is cater for more bikes and have cycle paths and things. I think, well, that's it's what we want at the moment, but you've got to think in 20 years time, are you going to be left with this estate with all these little bike paths weaving everywhere that are all run down and kids use them to run through to rob things? So you've got to be careful you don't design for what's fashionable now or what might sound good to the people or the planners, and then you're left with like some of these estates in the past had all these alleyways, didn't they, or concrete underpasses that was they thought would work at the time, but then sort of failed. So I suppose you've got to look at that as well.
You're right, Daniel, but I think the reality is that we've learnt a lot more about design, and quite a lot of those things like underpasses and things, they were just a bad idea, and the reason they didn't work is pretty scientific. You can't see where you're going, you can't really ever know where you're going, and you can't see people properly behind you, and people can lurk and all this kind of stuff. So they feel, not only are unsafe quite often, but they feel unsafe. So the way that we design now, you have to, I think, well, we call it legibility. You've got to understand where you're going. It's got to make sense to you. And I think those kind of core principles, whether it's navigating a car, a bike, whether you're walking around, you've got to be able to get around the place well. And if you think, it's a really good test of whether a place has got quality. If you think whether you can find your way around it, and just think how many modern housing estates you get lost in, because they haven't got that kind of wayfinding that I guess we had in the old market towns or whatever. You had the square, you had the kind of the church tower, you knew where you were pretty much all the time. Now we don't have that, so I'd like to think in how we design in the future, especially with garden cities, we're going to put some of that legibility back to make places much more livable. Well, I think we can't talk about garden cities without talking about Ebbsfleet, so
No.
we ought to touch on that. Obviously, I guess it's not, strictly speaking, in your patch, is it? Or is it? I don't know how it...
It's kind of on the
matter?
outskirts, but no, it doesn't matter, because I think it's something that is interest to us, and obviously if it's built, it's quite a big development.
Huge. I mean, essentially, as far as I understand it, what's happened is the government has committed to building 15,000 homes, and it's setting up a particular way of doing that right now to make that happen in the Ebbsfleet Valley, next to Ebbsfleet Station, where I think a lot of people thought that development would have happened by now, but for whatever reason it hasn't. And this is a way of kick-starting that development. And of course, side by side, possibly now, is the new Paramount development, the Paramount project. And it's having looked into it a little bit, it's certainly more than just a theme park. It's a huge development, capable of providing thousands of jobs. So in a sense, it begins to feel like it becomes part of the garden city in a way. Really interesting area and a really interesting project. I mean, I was on the radio a little while back talking about it and was very enthusiastic about the possibilities of Ebbsfleet, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it's. I was just thinking there. It's all the hidden infrastructure. So even when you build, you've got to provide the work, the infrastructure, the roads, even if it's sort of a way out, and it's how you sort of do all that in the right way. I was just thinking it's. Can you sort of, you talking about having little villages and little areas, I suppose, can you have lots of different developers all building little bits, which is kind of what's happened here on the island with the Thistle Hill area. That seems to be different developments building it, but sometimes it's all very similar as well.
Yes,
but I suppose if you could do it so that each one was completely differently themed or felt different, you'd really create something.
You would, but again, I think going back to the Wolfson Prize, it's something we've touched on almost every time I've been over, Daniel, and it's certainly all the 5 shortlisted entries talk about local ownership and that notion of local people being really behind what's happening right from the start, and it's still the case too often in planning that you do get. As we talked last time, you get this notion of community opposition because the community feels a solution has been imposed on them. So you might have different themes or whatever, but what actually you've got to get is you've got to get the community, the local people, shaping the place with you. And there's lots of ways of doing that now, and really encouraging to see. And I hope your readers, when they have a look at these, will see that a lot of them are actually based on this notion of local people shaping their own places.
Well, that's what's quite nice about this prize, looking through it, that it's a selection of different people, and as you said, they've even got sort of school children involved and everyday people. It's one of those things, I think sometimes you sort of see these prizes, they get mentioned on the telly or they're in the distance, and you think it's again a bigger area deciding what's going to happen, and you never get a say. But with this prize, that's why I was so glad we could sort of cover this this evening. So it's a good way of making people aware that it is something that you're looking for everyone to sort of have a say and an input, and that's hopefully what can make it work if it's going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. It would be great. Also, I mean, there's potentially a lot going on in Swale as well, no doubt about it, in terms of housing, and the economy seems to be changing. North Kent generally. I mean, we're talking about the possibility, aren't we, of an airport or not? We don't know really. No. We certainly got a new Thames crossing. We don't know where that's going to go yet. We've got the possibility of Crossrail coming into North Kent, Crossrail 2, and new roads as well, but hopefully more public transport, which is great. So there's a lot going on suddenly, possibly in North Kent. So how do we protect what is the Garden of England? It becomes incredibly important.
Yeah, and I suppose it's again, coming back to that, how do you get a say or an input, or even find out about what is happening in the right way?
Well, hopefully you and I are doing our bit here to highlight some things that are going on. But you're right, there must be a way, in the 21st century of being able to communicate using the internet more. And I think there are. It's just, of course, it all costs money. But if there's a local civic society, that's worth joining. You can always talk to us, Design Southeast, about things and try and find out what's going on. Increasingly, projects are being publicised now, and it would be great to see projects moving away from just the industry, as it were, talking about them, and to people talking about them. You're absolutely right, and we'd love to be a part of making that happen.
In this prize we've been talking about was how they were getting school kids involved, and I was sort of thinking about that as here on the island, probably school kids are possibly being influenced by architecture and design without even realising, or they might be quite aware of it if they've been included, because we've got a brand new academy site in Minster and Sheerness. You've got the St George's School, which really isn't that old, although it was built a few years ago, and down in Laysdown we've got the new primary school down there, which was influenced by a wing design. So there's actually a big part of school children on the island going to new schools that have obviously been designed in a modern way.
It's true, isn't it? It's true. I mean, the school I went to was really, really old. I think most of us did. But this generation, I guess it started in the 60s, 70s, didn't it, with the school building programmes. But the Building Schools of the Future kicked it off about 10 years ago. And then, of course, we've got the academies now and new primary schools. So, yeah, it's great. And it would be really interesting to work out what kids now think of architecture. It's not very much on the curriculum anymore, I'm afraid, as part of culture, unfortunately, but it'd be really good. And it's great to see that, these kids have entered this prize, because it obviously inspires them.
Yeah, and I think it's also good because it may encourage schools to sort of hopefully be aware of this prize, even by us talking about it, and maybe they can sort of get involved or be aware of it. And as I said, at the moment it's an ideal time because there's these new schools that have been built, so architecture has played a sort of a big part. Something I probably would have loved, because they've been, while they were going to school, they were watching the new one being built, and then they've moved into the new one while the old one's been pulled down, which I assume possibly there was a bit of an overlap, so some of them might have missed one or the other, but it's certainly been an interesting thing to have watched and experienced.
Definitely.
I would have thought.
Definitely, but I think also what's interesting about these young people's entrance into this prize is that, of course, it's exactly what we're talking about. It's them shaping their future. And if they can work with architects, engineers, economists, all these kind of people who do it for their day job, so they're really skilled at drawing, maths and all this kind of stuff, and they can help local people make it all happen. It seems to me that's a kind of perfect marriage between local people and professionals, I suppose. So if we could look at some kind of model like that, which actually quite a lot of the Wilson Prize entries do, if we could look at that, I think maybe, do you think we've got something that could be a bit more positive in terms of the quality that we get out of it?
Yeah, I think so, because it is that often that fear thing. People suddenly worry about what's going to be built, what's going to be on their doorstep. And as I think we said once before, if they're actually involved and had a way of finding out most people, it wouldn't be quite as bad as they thought. Or if it is as bad as they thought, they're actually in an opportunity to actually say something and perhaps change it before that bad plan ever becomes through. And if you're sort of involving school children involved, it creates that awareness early on, which it's one of those things you never know the long-term effects, but it's always worth doing. Them sort of things you're never going to know straight away whether that kid decides to become an architect in years to come, or whether in 20 years time they move to an area and suddenly an housing estate's been built on their doorstep, and because they were involved they might have a better understanding or a more open mind to what's happening. So it's that long-term effect which you just can't see straight away, but can be very important.
No, you're right, and I think it isn't just about their career, is it? It's about the whole because once you get involved in these things, it's about decision making, it's about learning to debate and discuss things. There's all kinds of stuff actually about design. But obviously at one point, maybe some will become architects, and that's great. I mean, we, whenever we do talks and things, we always find young people come and they get a lot out of it. And the other key thing is that I think people should never be frightened of saying what they think about something. In fact, a lot of people aren't, of course, but they sometimes feel a little bit overawed by professionals, by architects or whatever, and they shouldn't. Because most architects, if they're good, are very, very good at working with people and drawing out ideas. We're not everyone can be an architect, but everyone should have a stake in their place. And it's for the architect or the master planner or the urban designer or planner to work with people and just begin to sort of just talk to them and think, well, what do you mean by this? Let's just talk about that and see what we can get, and let's try and make a vision for this place together. And I think that kind of thing is great.
And is that kind of where even Design South East plays a part in building those bridges in some ways?
We do. I mean, we do a lot of work now, I guess helping to make a more constructive dialogue between local people and planners and developers. Because we're independent and not-for-profit, we're trusted by everybody to work for the benefit of the place rather than for the developer or for the local authority or indeed for the community. So we always think long-term. And the other thing we do is when we give design advice, again, because we've got no commercial interests at all, we can again be independent. So we're trusted by everybody. For us, the client is the place that we're helping, really, and we're there for its long-term benefit, not short-term benefit of any one particular party. And I think people respond to that well. People get that, and at the moment, there's some tough conversations around housing and housing growth and housing numbers. We've got to build somewhere, but there needs to be a conversation about where and how and what quality and what role people have in that, which actually, again, all the Garden City entries have come up with a mechanism of what's called governance, of how you actually manage a place. It's very, very important. So yeah, I mean, that's very much about Design South East and what we're trained to do.
Which I think is good, and I think that's the other thing I sometimes find. You even look at this competition, you sort of got the school kids, normal people, you've got companies and individuals putting an input, but then sometimes that sort of all happens and then it kind of drifts away, and then the next thing you hear, planning permission's got a new company comes in, and you feel they haven't even took any notice of that, and it's making those connections sometimes. I think people don't always see that, and I think it's also the time. For years, perhaps they were talking about this new Garden City, and different bits come on the news, and it drifts away, and you get on with your everyday life. Then it all rears up again in the news, and it drops off. And I think sometimes that's how people sometimes lose connection or lose interest in it sometimes, and it's keeping that sort of momentum going, or that involvement going, so it doesn't feel like that. Yeah,
because the fact is that at the end of the day, we're all going to be living in that built environment, aren't we? So the idea that someone makes it for you and you move into it and you kind of try and live with it, it's, you just think, well, hang on a minute, isn't there a way that you could be engaged at the beginning? Particularly if you already live there, you're going to want a hand in shaping its future. It's obvious. But what we need to do, and what I think Design South East are good at, is making it non-confrontational, so that we can actually have a dialogue, a constructive dialogue about it, rather than saying no, yes, no, yes. There's probably a bit of that, but actually we've probably got to meet somewhere in the middle if we want to get anything done. But more importantly, what we want to get on is talking about real quality of place, because North Kent generally, it's an exceptional place, incredible place, and we know that some of it's going to get built on. We know that, and it's pretty obvious. But we can do that well. I think we've got to kind of recover our belief in ourselves that good design can add to the landscape and not necessarily take away from it.
I suppose it's also never too late, because it's often easy to feel, there's been all these little estates built and there's been mistakes, and technically, those houses, they're well built, so they could be there for, there's houses that have been about for 200 years and they're not even sitting on a foundation, technically. These houses that are being built at the moment technically could be there as long as, 200 years plus. But the other thing is, it's never too late, because we're always building new stuff, and at some point it will have value if you do get that place right.
Yeah, and I think if you do really put the effort in, it is worth it. And you're right, it's never too late, because as soon as you start raising the bar and raising the standard, you can't really row back from that. Once you get a good standard going, which I think is really important with Ebbsfleet, that what gets built is very, very high quality from the start, because it is difficult to get that back. You need to set a benchmark at the beginning.
Yeah, because once it's done, it's done. It's done.
Yeah.
Our theme has been garden cities, and I think we're just going to have a little bit of a round-up before you go, Chris.
We are. I don't think we've solved the housing crisis yet, Daniel.
No.
But I think what we're saying is garden cities, one possible solution, but we need to, I guess, learn from the past and think, well, what can we do differently? And that is about engaging people. It is about quality of place. It is about thinking how we make places gradually over time, rather than just as one kind of monolithic, great big city type of idea. So it's beginning to get a more human scale, I think, is what we're really talking about.
And I think it's, how you get how you feel you get involved yourself, because I said, you see it sort of on the news, it's a bit distant. That's why I was glad when you sent me about this price, because architecture is something I'm quite interested in. I wasn't fully aware of this, and it was actually useful for me to read through and watch some of the YouTube videos, and it gives you an insight into what's possible and what other people are putting forward, and even might encourage you to be involved. So I was glad. I thought, when you sent that to me, it's something we've got to cover for our listeners, because it's another way of finding out information.
It is, and the reality is, of the 5 shortlisted, some of them are actually proposed for Kent. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So, you might be involved in any case, because you might actually be living where it's going to be happening, and that's going to affect you. So I think this is the time to start picking up that interest and thinking, well, how do I get involved in shaping the future? Because it's coming to you now. The reality is that we're going to have to deal with housing. London is growing enormously all the time, and there's this overspill factor and all kinds of stuff, and how we actually make better places through that process is, I think, what we have to focus on.
Is there anything else you'd like to cover, or useful contact details you can give our listeners?
Well, Daniel, obviously you can contact us anytime on 01634 and I've forgotten the number. It'll come back to me in a second, I'm sure. But you can also, 401 166, it did come back to me, thank goodness. You can also, something I really do want to tell you about, we've launched this thing called Kent Design it's designed to bring people together to shape the built environment. And again, it isn't just for the professionals. We really want everybody to get involved. If they'd like to know, if any of your listeners would like to know more information, just contact us at any time, and we'll help you get you involved in Kent Design. The other key thing is we're going to do a conference on the 21st Century Garden City, and that will be in the Ebbsfleet area in late October. And to check for the exact date, you just go to www.kentdesign.org.
Well, Chris, as always, I'd like to thank you very much once again for coming along and allowing us to cover this current subject, which was garden cities.
It's a pleasure, Daniel. It's always good to talk to you and your enthusiasm for architecture and place, because I think that's what it's about as well, isn't it? It is about the places we live in. It's really inspiring, so thank you.